or only in a very minor way. Um, I feel a bit of a fraud actually here because I'm introducing a Bengali writer to a Bengali audience. What am I doing here, you might well ask. I suppose I'm here because I'm a fan of Amit's work, and I'm a fan of it because when I first read it in the early 1990s, I was immediately attracted to it for a kind of non-literary reason, really, which is that I knew South Calcutta a little, and suddenly I found it instantly portrayed to me in a very, very believable way, in a way that rang true. And I think his prose does have that kind of, you believe that these things have happened to the people they've happened to, which isn't as common in literature as you might think. I know he needs no introduction, but I think I should say that he's an academic. You're a professor as well as a writer. You're also a musician, both as a singer and what am I doing wrong? Is that better? A singer and a composer of experimental music. Yeah. And as a poet, a novelist, and most recently as a writer of an interesting book on Calcutta called 2 Years in the City. And I'd like to start as a way of getting into his fiction by reading something from it, which is an interesting description of his books. And Amit says that when I look at my novels, I see that they're mostly structured around journeys and visits rather than stories and plot. My stories aren't about day-to-day life, but breaks and interruptions in the business of living, often caused by a change of venue. Now, I mean, that seems a very plain description of what you do. Can you give us any idea of how it began for you, how the kind of process of writing began for you in the early 1990s? Doesn't work? Try this one.
I was asked to hand you this mic.
Were you?
Anyway.
Okay.
So, firstly, let me apologize in advance for talking about writing and literature, subjects which are not generally spoken about at literary festivals.
Mm-hmm.
But unpopular as they are as subjects, we will sort of try and address them. You asked me about, I don't know what, my cell phone is off, so it's not me.
So is mine.
So and I saw you switch yours.
Yes, I switched mine off. I'll just check it again.
Yeah. So your question is about how I got round to writing in the 1990s. So the answer is actually that I wanted to write for a very long time. So I had a number of fantasy careers, and writing was one of them. And those fantasy careers burgeoned in my consciousness quite early. I mean, and so wanting to be a chauffeur of a car was one that stayed with me for a while. But I think also wanting to be a writer, which is unusual as a kind of fantasy career side by side, alongside a hope for career as a chauffeur. I mean, one might think that the chauffeur would be succeeded by something else, and then that by wanting to be a writer. But these were coexisting sort of.
You wanted to be a writing chauffeur? Probably.
I think I wanted the chauffeur's sense of authority and his uniform, but I became interested in writing early, mainly because I think one of the reasons I've looked back on why I became interested in writing so early in my life, and this is, I think, had something to do with the fact that when I was very small, I only spoke and understood Bengali and Hindi. So Hindi, I was growing up in Bombay. I was born here, I was growing up in Bombay. A child of quite nationalistic Bengali parents, middle-class Bengali parents. And my parents only spoke to me in Bengali at home. And when I went to school, I would be accompanied by servants who spoke to you in Hindi. So it was a kind of slightly Kipling-esque sort of childhood in that sense.
So your parents must have spoken to each other in English.
They spoke to each other in Bengali. Not only did they speak to each other in Bengali, but they spoke to each other in a dialect of Bengali called Sylheti.
Right.
Which is the East Bengali dialect.
Yes, you know, I understand. Yeah,
And I think quite early on they took a decision not to speak to me in Sylheti. Otherwise, I might have been a writer in Sylheti.
On that point,
yes.
I have to say that I tried to learn Bengali once, and I had a Sylheti teacher.
Yeah.
And when I told my Bengali friends I was learning from a Sylheti, they burst into peals of laughter and said I could never possibly learn Bengali in that way.
Yes. Sylheti is meant generally to kind of evoke and provoke laughter because of its robust kind of phonetic presence. But my parents, as I said, they took this decision not to speak to me in Sylheti, but I grew up listening to that language, but speaking to me in Bangla and a smattering of English. But when I was admitted into Cathedral School in Bombay, which is a posh English language school, which actually Salman Rushdie went to as well. Yeah. I had no English at all, and I think the headmistress of the infant school, who was actually half Bengali, half English, I remember as Mrs. Banerjee, said to my mother, give him Ladybird books to read and comic books to read. So that was a kind of life-changing moment, reading Ladybird books about John and Jill going to the beach and playing on the sand and discovering comic books. And that is what led me to writing quite early on, I think, quite possibly the discovery of a new language.
Right.
Yeah. So, and this new language was English. So, and then after that, for a very long time, I think I continued. I mean, the other professions fell away. The chauffeur or whatever the other ones were. I stayed with music and writing, but my chosen genre for a long time was poetry, rather than fiction. I never thought that I would one day write a novel.
Did your family offer you any kind of models? I mean, was your mother a writer, your father a writer? Your father worked for Britannia Biscuits, am I right to say that?
Yeah.
And your mother was a bit of a musician, an amateur musician, a good amateur musician.
I mean, I would say she's one of the most gifted singers of Tagore songs of her generation.
Right.
Yes. She's a marvelous singer, and my father was a corporate man and a very successful one. But with early beginnings in pursuing English literature as a kind of enthusiasm, I think he did his first degree in Calcutta University in the 1940s in English literature, before moving towards finance and commerce, and then going away to England and doing his chartered accountancy exams over there.
And then you went to England yourself.
Yeah.
Did that encourage you towards writing being there, doing English, being in a country that was far removed from the one you came from? Did that bring anything out in you that made you think I should write about this?
I mean, because my father worked in Britannia Biscuits, I first went to England as a child in 1973. And that was a very interesting experience in retrospect, but not at that time an encouraging one because of the rise of the National Front. Enoch Powell had made a speech only a few years prior to my visit. I could sense that there was something in the air, but it was a lovely summer. I also sensed the kind of the last of the Carnaby Street fashions and all of that. And just post-Beatles breakup. Indians were known for their godmen and mysticism.
Yes.
Godmen who then turned out to be reprobates.
Yes.
So I wasn't encouraged by that experience, but nevertheless wanted to get back to England because of my kind of affinities to English literature as a subject and to writing as a vocation. And it wasn't as if I was thinking, I'm on the periphery here in India, I'm on the periphery in Bombay, and that's where the former mother country is, or that's where the center is. I wasn't thinking in those terms at all. That it wouldn't have occurred to me to think of Bombay as a peripheral place. If anything, Bombay felt peripheral to me to Calcutta, which seemed then a much more exciting city. But I did feel that, I want to get published in magazines like Encounter, and it has a list of some of those magazines.
Yes.
And I think the best way to do that is just go nearer where Encounter offices are, where the Encounter offices are, and just go there. And at that time, I think studying English, or reading English, or whatever, however you wish to kind of phrase it, was the chosen path of writers for people who wanted to make a career out of writing. There were no creative writing schools at that time. That whole industry hadn't come into being. So writing meant also being interested in reading and thinking about reading and writing, which is what the pursuit of literature was. And that
but
took
it would
me
never have occurred to you to have written, appearing in Desh and writing in Bengali was not ever an ambition.
So that option was precluded as for me as far as I was concerned, because I'd grown up in Bombay. So not knowing, not having learned Bengali in school, though I did have on and off private tutors come home and teach me written Bengali, all of that. But to someone such as I, who when I was growing up was anyway extremely opposed to any kind of discipline and study, even the kind of discipline and study that school imposed on me, that there was very little chance that I would actually do things of my own will at home.
Right.
Yeah, so I never learned Bengali that well as to be able to begin to write fiction or poetry in it.
So English was the medium, and you were in London, and you were studying at UCL, was it, in London, University College London?
Yeah.
What was the first thing you wrote that was published?
Well, the first things that I wrote that got published were poems that I wrote for a magazine that used to come out in Bombay called Bombay Bichitra. Everybody is looking kind of extremely serious at the mention of this publication. They know it is a very famous, magazine. It was run basically by housewives in Bombay, and somebody knew that I wrote poetry as a 13-year-old, and so my poems would come out at age 11, age 13.
Right.
And those were actually my first publications. Then there was another place, there were only so many places where children writing in English could send off their poems. So there was a place called Sainik Samachar, where I also got published. Now, my first series, then I got published in a national magazine called the Illustrated Weekly of India.
Yes, I know it.
That was a poem chosen by Kamala Das, quite a well-known Indian poet. And the Youth Times, there was another kind of magazine for young people, where I was picked up by Pritish Nandi, and he published 2 pages of my poems when I was 15. I was extremely proud. So I exhausted all the possibilities. There was Debonair. They published my poetry as well by the time I was 17 or 18. And then Chandrabhaga, there was this magazine edited by the Indian poet Jayanta Mahapatra. And that was a big thing for me, because that was a serious literary magazine. And my first publication in a UK national magazine was in the London Review of Books in 1986, which a poem called Sensible Road. And shortly after, at that time in the London magazine, Alan Ross's London magazine, 2 poems came out then. So 1986-87.
Right. And did you have any other career in mind apart from writing then, or was it?
Sorry?
Was being a chauffeur, that was out of the question?
That was then, yeah. Because I hadn't learned, inadvertently I hadn't learned how to drive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was no other career open. You thought you were going to be an academic and a writer.
I never thought I was going to be an academic, and I still flinch when people call me a professor or an academic. I mean, I used to flinch when people used to call me writer, because it seemed presumptuous to claim such a title. But now, after having been called academic or professor, I say no, writer, please. So, no, I never wanted to be an academic. No, I wanted to continue to do things which would legitimize my stay in England while I tried to get published in Encounter. So doing my BA and then my PhD and all of that. But as it happened, my first two books, A Strange and Sublime Address and Afternoon Rug, came out before I finished my PhD. So I think Afternoon Rug came out a week before I had my Viva in Oxford.
My first encounter with you came when I was editing Granta, and it was an interesting encounter for me because this was in the mid-90s, I guess. I hadn't come across you before. I was instantly attracted to your work. That's certainly true. But also, I remember you for a very, I don't know how you describe this in literature, but it's when somebody from a different society expects to be taken as seriously on the same grounds, for the same reasons, as somebody from the society that you're in. Sorry, that's not very clear. What I mean is this. I remember Amit had a story which included a reference to Chowringhee. And there is a bit of every editor everywhere that wants to make everything in anything intelligible to everybody. You see what I mean? So my pen came across this word Chowringhee, and I thought, well, I can't just say comma, Calcutta's principal thoroughfare. So how do I nudge people in the direction of understanding what this word means? And I think the solution was to leave it as it was, so that, I think you made the point that when Yeats put in when you were made to read Yeats at school, nobody had lots of footnotes saying,
especially Yeats didn't have an interjection saying
exactly.
Innisfree in the north of wherever.
He didn't, that's very true. So that was a kind of lesson for me, really, because until then I'd kind of gone along with what my Calcutta brother-in-law used to call the National Geographic School of Fiction, which was that when it said Brahmin, it had a little kind of comma and then said India's leading caste or whatever, which you would get in a magazine like National Geographic, but you certainly shouldn't get in fiction of any quality. But I think, and I may be wrong, you must correct me on this, Amit, but I've always believed that when the New Yorker published you, there was a bit more, you were a bit more tolerant to a bit of intervention there.
No, I wasn't.
You weren't?
No.
Okay, sorry, that's a calumny on you then, I'm really sorry, I've always believed that. But it was interesting because until then, and this, of course Salman Rushdie had come, and we all know about that, but there was still a lingering idea that you had to explain things to a different audience, which I think now has largely vanished, hasn't it?
It probably has, yeah. But having said rather glibly that it probably has, I think to myself that, publishers, we are now talking about a different publishing scenario. Maybe it was coming into existence when you were at Granta in the 90s. But you know that publishers are now, in Britain at least, and maybe in other parts of the world as well, more cowardly than ever. Very nervous about sales and
yes, they are. Sure.
So for me to say that it probably things have relaxed, things have evolved as you would have wanted them to evolve from when you first encountered me as a writer, would maybe not would be to present a slightly inaccurate and wishful picture of the way things really are. No, I think there is still great nervousness about particularity and specificity in fiction, in any fiction. But people are willing to take it on board if it comes from a recognized source within your own culture. If it comes from outside, and I think the honeymoon period with Indian writing is slightly over.
Yes.
Which is a good thing, I think. I think what happens outside of any honeymoon period is always is what matters. So I don't think that I think writers might be now sort of more confident or more upfront about not wanting to explain or simplify. But I think the point you make is an interesting one about wanting to be judged in the same way as, say, you would judge a writer, a generic writer within quotes, rather than being judged on as an Indian writer. And that doesn't only have to do with explaining what Chowringhee is. It has to do with the way you write
Yes.
and how you pitch that writing.
Yes, yes. I suppose what I'm driving at really is and I'm sorry, these are tiny details, but they're always interesting, I think, to talk about, because editing is a matter of tiny details. I mean, just a further example, and I'll stop giving examples, but in Arundhati, we took a piece from Arundhati Roy's novel, God of Small Things, in which I made one useful intervention. I cut the number of bogies on a Kerala passenger train from 50 to 19, which seemed more reasonable to me.
And you're an authority on trains.
Because I'm fond of trains. But my pencil hovered over the words, the initials P. She said, refer to something as a PWD building. I know that means Public Works Department, but I didn't know if the audience in general would know that. Now, that's a tiny thing, and it doesn't matter. But I suppose what I'm driving at really is your sense of audience. Do you have a sense of audience? When you write, do you think I'm writing for Ballygunge or I'm writing for Highbury in North London, or does that kind of thought never cross your mind?
I mean, very frankly, if I began to think, no, it crosses my mind in different contexts. So I will tell you in which contexts in a minute. But generally, when I think of something I want to write about, I really don't think, oh, should I be writing this for the audience in Ballygunge or the one in Islington?